Welcome to Silent Fears, where the darkness between the lines reveals the most terrifying truths. Hit that subscribe button if you're ready to confront the road trips that changed everything. Because tonight, we're uncovering 7 documented cases that prove sometimes the scariest journey is the one you never planned to take. These aren't your typical travel horror stories. These are verified accounts from police reports, emergency calls, and survivor testimonies of ordinary people who encountered something on America's highways that defied every rational explanation. From GPS systems that lead to places that don't exist to hitchhikers who vanish without a trace, these stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about the open road. Let's move to our first story. This account comes from a maintenance worker named Frank, documented in Nevada Highway Patrol files from November 1997. Frank was 53 years old at the time, a veteran employee of the Nevada Department of Transportation who had been working the lonely stretches of Highway 50 through the Carson Desert for over 2 decades. The incident occurred during what should have been a routine emergency call to clear debris from the eastbound lanes near mile marker 47, approximately 30 miles outside of Fallon. Frank had received the call around 2:30 a.m. from dispatch, reporting scattered rocks across the roadway that needed immediate attention to prevent potential accidents. He loaded his orange work truck with the usual equipment: safety cones, reflective signs, a portable light tower, and headed out into the November darkness. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and a thin layer of frost covered everything, making the desert landscape look almost otherworldly under his headlights. Frank had made this drive countless times before, knew every curve and straightaway, every landmark along this desolate stretch of what locals called the loneliest road in America. But something felt different that night, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. The first sign that something was wrong came at mile marker 42, still 5 miles from his destination. Frank noticed headlights in his rearview mirror, which wasn't unusual. Highway 50 did get occasional traffic even in the dead of night, mostly long-haul truckers pushing through to make their delivery schedules. But these headlights seemed to be maintaining the exact same distance behind him, never getting closer, never falling back, just staying there like they were tethered to his truck. Frank adjusted his speed a couple of times, slowing down and then speeding up slightly. But the headlights matched his pace perfectly. He began to feel a creeping sense of unease, that primitive instinct that tells you when you're being watched or followed. The rational part of his mind tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was just another state worker heading to the same call, or a trucker who happened to be going the same speed. But Frank's gut told him otherwise. And after 20-plus years working these isolated roads, he had learned to trust his instincts. By mile marker 45, the headlights were still there, unchanged, unwavering. Frank decided to pull over and let whatever vehicle was behind him pass, figuring that would solve the mystery and ease his growing anxiety. He slowed down and moved to the shoulder, his emergency flashers blinking orange in the darkness. He watched his mirrors expectantly, waiting to see what kind of vehicle would drive by, maybe even get a look at the driver who had been pacing him so perfectly. But nothing happened. The headlights had simply vanished, as if they had never been there at all. Frank sat there for nearly 5 minutes, engine idling, scanning the darkness in all directions. The road stretched empty in both directions, no taillights disappearing into the distance. No sound of an engine, nothing to indicate where the mysterious vehicle could have gone. The desert was completely silent, except for the hum of his own truck, shaking off the incident as some kind of optical illusion or fatigue-induced hallucination. Frank pulled back onto the highway and continued toward mile marker 47. But his relief was short-lived. Within minutes, the headlights reappeared in his mirror, maintaining that same precise distance, same unwavering intensity. This time, Frank was certain he wasn't imagining things. He grabbed his radio and called dispatch, his voice betraying none of the fear that was beginning to build in his chest. "Dispatch, this is Frank in Unit 47. I've got what appears to be another state vehicle following me on Highway 50 eastbound. Can you confirm if anyone else is responding to the mile marker 47 call?" The response came back negative. Frank was the only unit dispatched to that location. The radio operator asked if he needed backup, but Frank declined, not wanting to sound paranoid or unstable. He was a professional with 2 decades of experience. He could handle whatever this was. As Frank approached his destination, he decided on a test. Instead of stopping at mile marker 47, where the debris was reported, he continued driving past it, wanting to see what the mysterious follower would do. The headlights stayed with him, never wavering, never changing position. Frank drove another 10 miles before finally pulling over again, this time in a wide turnout used by the highway department for equipment storage. He parked his truck, turned off the engine, and stepped outside into the freezing desert air, his breath forming clouds in the darkness. The headlights behind him had stopped as well, positioned perhaps 100 yards back on the shoulder. Frank could see the lights clearly, twin beams cutting through the night. But he couldn't make out the vehicle itself. It seemed to be hidden in its own light, as if the headlights were somehow brighter and more intense than they should be. Frank called out into the darkness, "Highway Department! Identify yourself." His voice echoed across the empty desert, but there was no response. He reached into his truck for a powerful flashlight and started walking back toward the mysterious vehicle, his footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. As he got closer, something became increasingly wrong with what he was seeing. The headlights seemed to be hovering at the wrong height, too high for a car, too low for a semi-truck, and there was no sound at all. No engine noise, no idle, nothing. Most disturbing of all, Frank realized, he couldn't see any part of the vehicle the lights should be attached to. It was as if the headlights were somehow suspended in midair, casting their cold white glow across the asphalt. When Frank reached the spot where the vehicle should have been, there was nothing there. Just empty road, empty desert, and the lingering scent of something like burning oil mixed with ozone. The headlights had vanished again, leaving no trace, no tire marks, no evidence that anything had ever been there. Frank stood alone in the middle of Highway 50, flashlight beam cutting weakly through the darkness, trying to make sense of what he had experienced. According to the official report he filed the next day, Frank completed his original assignment, cleared the debris at mile marker 47, and returned to the maintenance yard without further incident. But he also requested a transfer to daytime shifts and refused to work solo assignments on Highway 50 after dark. The Nevada Highway Patrol investigated Frank's report as part of their standard procedure for unusual incidents involving state employees. They found no evidence of another vehicle in the area that night, no other reports of unusual activity, and no mechanical or environmental factors that could explain what Frank had seen. The investigating officer noted in his report that Frank appeared credible and showed no signs of substance abuse or mental distress. The case was classified as unexplained phenomena and filed away. Frank continued working for the Nevada Department of Transportation for another 8 years before retiring. But he never spoke publicly about that night on Highway 50 until a local journalist tracked him down in 2019. Even then, more than 20 years later, Frank's hands trembled slightly as he recounted the incident, and he insisted that whatever had followed him that night was not of this world. The most disturbing part, Frank admitted, wasn't the mysterious headlights themselves. It was the feeling that whatever was behind those lights had been watching him, studying him, with an intelligence that felt ancient and utterly alien. To this day, maintenance workers on Highway 50 report similar incidents during late-night shifts, though none have been as extensively documented as Frank's encounter. The Nevada Department of Transportation now has an unofficial policy of sending crews out in pairs for nighttime emergency calls on that particular stretch of road, though they've never officially acknowledged why. Let's move to our second story. This documented case comes from the personal blog entries of Sophia, a 28-year-old travel blogger and social media influencer who was known for her motorcycle adventures across remote American highways. Her final blog posts were discovered by authorities in December 2014, 3 days after she failed to check in with her family during what should have been a routine solo ride through the Blue Ridge Parkway in Virginia. Sophia had been documenting her cross-country motorcycle tour for over 6 months, building a substantial following of adventure enthusiasts who lived vicariously through her fearless exploration of America's most scenic and isolated roads. The entries that follow were recovered from her laptop, found in her abandoned campsite near milepost 85 on the Blue Ridge Parkway. Her Harley-Davidson Sportster was discovered 2 miles away, parked perfectly upright on a scenic overlook, with no mechanical issues and plenty of fuel remaining. Sophia herself was found 4 days later, walking aimlessly along a hiking trail 15 miles from her campsite, with no memory of the previous week and speaking incoherently about the road that goes backwards through time. Her final coherent blog entry, dated December 18, 2014, reads as follows: Day 187 of the Great American Road Trip. Currently camped at Big Meadows on Skyline Drive, getting ready for tomorrow's ride through the Blue Ridge Parkway. The weather forecast looks perfect. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-40s, ideal for winter riding. I'm planning to take the scenic route through some of the most beautiful mountain curves in Virginia. My followers have been asking for more supernatural content lately, so I'm hoping to explore some of the local legends about mysterious fog and ghost sightings along these mountain roads. Little did I know how prophetic that last sentence would prove to be. The next entry, posted at 6:47 a.m. on December 19th, shows the first signs that something unusual was happening. Started my ride early this morning to catch the sunrise over the mountains. About 20 minutes into the ride, I encountered the most beautiful fog I've ever seen. Thick, silvery, almost luminescent in the early morning light. It rolled down from the peaks like a slow-motion avalanche, completely enveloping the road ahead. I stopped to take some photos for Instagram, but when I checked the camera, the fog wasn't showing up in any of the pictures. That's weird, right? The visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet, so I'm riding extra carefully. The strange thing is, I haven't seen any other vehicles since entering the fog bank. Not even any signs of recent traffic. No tire marks in the condensation on the asphalt. No footprints at the scenic overlooks. It's like I'm the only person who's been on this road in days. Her 8:23 a.m. entry reveals increasing confusion. I've been riding for what feels like hours, but my GPS keeps showing the same. Location, milepost 78. That can't be right. I know I've been moving, following the curves, going up and down hills. But somehow, I keep ending up at the same point. I tried turning around to go back, but the road behind me looks exactly the same as the road ahead. The fog is getting thicker, and there's something else strange. The trees look different than they did when I started this morning. They're fuller, greener, like it's late spring instead of December. Some of them have leaves that shouldn't exist this time of year, and I swear I can smell flowers blooming somewhere nearby. By 9:45 a.m., Sophia's entries show genuine distress. This is getting seriously weird. I stopped at what should be the same scenic overlook where I usually take my morning coffee break. But it's completely different. The parking area is smaller, the guardrails look newer, and there's a historical marker that I've never seen before, talking about Civil War battles in this area. But here's the really crazy part. The marker is dated 1963, which would make sense, except it looks brand new. Not weathered or faded at all, like it was just installed yesterday. I tried calling my mom to check in, but my phone shows no signal, even though I had full bars when I started the ride. The GPS isn't working either, just spinning endlessly trying to locate satellites. Her 11:30 a.m. entry becomes increasingly frantic. I think I'm trapped in some kind of loop. I've been keeping careful track of the mile markers, and I swear I've passed the same ones multiple times. Milepost 76, then 77, then 78, then somehow back to 76 again. The worst part is that each time I pass the same marker, it looks slightly different. Different level of wear, different graffiti, sometimes different dates on the installation tags. I stopped to examine one more closely, and the metal plaque showed a manufacturing date of 1987. But when I rode past the same marker 20 minutes later, it showed 1994. I'm starting to think the fog isn't natural. There's something about the way it moves, too deliberately, like it's herding me in a specific direction. Her afternoon entries show a dramatic shift in tone. The fog lifted around 2 p.m., and suddenly everything looked normal again. The trees are back to their winter appearance, bare branches and brown grass, exactly what you'd expect for December in Virginia. My GPS started working, showing that I was at milepost 82, which makes sense given how long I'd been riding. I felt incredibly relieved and stopped at the next overlook to eat lunch and try to make sense of what had happened. But when I looked back at the road I just traveled, I could see the fog banks still there, about a mile behind me, sitting perfectly still like a wall of silver. It wasn't moving with the wind or dissipating like normal fog should. It was just sitting there, waiting. Her 4:18 p.m. entry reveals a disturbing discovery. I decided to investigate the fog more carefully, so I walked back down the road toward where I could see the edge of it. As I got closer, I started hearing sounds from within the fog. Motorcycle engines, but not modern ones. They sounded older, rougher, like the bikes from decades ago. I also heard voices, people calling out to each other, but the words were muffled and indistinct. When I reached the edge of the fog and stuck my hand into it, the temperature dropped by at least 20 degrees. My hand came back wet, but not with normal moisture. It was oily, almost viscous, and it smelled like old gasoline and cigarettes. I tried to take a video with my phone, but the camera kept malfunctioning, showing static and strange colors that don't exist in nature. Her final coherent entry, posted at 6:55 p.m., shows complete bewilderment. I made camp for the night about 5 miles from the fog bank, but I can still see it in my rearview mirror, unchanged, unmoved. As evening approached, I started seeing lights within the fog. Not headlights, but something softer, more yellow, like old-fashioned lanterns, or maybe the lights from buildings. I can hear music now, too. Faint, but definitely there. Like a radio playing songs from the 1950s or 1960s. Part of me wants to go back and investigate more thoroughly. But every instinct I have is screaming at me to stay away. There's something fundamentally wrong with that fog. Something that doesn't belong in our time, or maybe even our reality. I'm going to try to get some sleep and head out early in the morning, taking a different route that avoids that area entirely. The blog entries end there, but investigators found several draft posts that were never published, becoming increasingly incoherent and filled with references to the people in the fog and the road that leads to yesterday. When Sophia was found 4 days later, she was physically unharmed, but appeared to have aged several years in the span of a week. Her hair had grown noticeably longer, and she had a deep tan despite it being winter in Virginia. Medical examinations revealed no signs of drug use or mental illness. But Sophia's memories of the missing time remained fragmented and contradictory. She spoke repeatedly about meeting other travelers trapped in the fog, people from different time periods who had become lost on the same stretch of road across multiple decades. Some claimed to be from the 1960s, others from the 1980s, all unable to find their way out of what Sophia described as a place between when things are supposed to be. The Virginia Department of Transportation investigated the area extensively, but found no unusual atmospheric conditions or environmental factors that could explain the phenomenon. However, they did uncover historical records of similar incidents dating back to the 1940s. Travelers who had disappeared for days or weeks on that particular stretch of the Blue Ridge Parkway, only to be found later with no clear memory of their missing time and stories of supernatural fog that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. Sophia never returned to motorcycle touring and rarely speaks about her experience, though she did mention in one interview that she sometimes still dreams about the people she met in the fog, wondering if they ever found their way home to their own time, or if they're still out there riding endlessly through decades that no longer exist. Let's move to our third story. This incident comes from the personal testimony of Marcus, a 17-year-old runaway who was fleeing an abusive home situation in rural Alabama during the summer of 2003. His account was documented by social services after he was found 3 days later, dehydrated and suffering from severe psychological trauma, wandering along Interstate 65, approximately 15 miles from where his nightmare began. Marcus had been hitchhiking north, hoping to reach Detroit where his older sister lived, when he was picked up by a Greyhound bus driver during an unscheduled stop at a remote truck plaza near the Tennessee border. The driver, a middle-aged man named Carl, who had been working the Birmingham to Nashville route for over a decade, noticed Marcus standing alone at the bus stop around 11 p.m. on a humid July night. Carl later told investigators that something about the kid's demeanor made him concerned. Marcus appeared nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, and was carrying only a small backpack, despite obviously planning to travel a long distance. Against company policy, Carl allowed Marcus to board without a ticket, telling him he could pay cash when they reached the next major stop in Nashville. Marcus climbed aboard the nearly empty bus, choosing a seat near the middle where only 2 other passengers were visible. An elderly woman sleeping near the front and what appeared to be another teenager slouched in a back corner seat, wearing a hooded sweatshirt. The bus pulled away from the truck stop and merged back onto the interstate, with Carl maintaining his usual professional demeanor, occasionally glancing in his rearview mirror to check on his passengers as they traveled through the dark Tennessee countryside. About 30 minutes into the ride, Marcus began to notice something odd about his fellow passengers. The elderly woman hadn't moved at all since he'd gotten on the bus, not even to adjust her position or shift in her sleep, which struck him as unnatural for someone trying to rest on an uncomfortable bus seat during a bumpy ride. More disturbing was the hooded figure in the back, who Marcus realized had been staring at him constantly since he'd boarded. Every time Marcus glanced back, he could see the pale outline of a face within the shadow of the hood, eyes fixed directly on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Marcus tried to dismiss his growing unease as paranoia brought on by stress and exhaustion from his desperate situation. But as the bus continued down the highway, more disturbing details began to emerge. He noticed that both passengers seemed to be wearing clothes that were decades out of style. The old woman's dress appeared to be from the 1950s or the 1960s, while the hooded figure wore what looked like a vintage Letterman jacket beneath the sweatshirt. More unsettling was the complete absence of any sounds from either of them. No breathing, no rustling of fabric, no small movements that living people unconsciously make, even when trying to be still. When Marcus finally worked up the courage to speak to the bus driver, asking how much longer until they reached Nashville, Carl's response chilled him to the bone. The driver turned slightly toward him and said in a flat, emotionless tone, "We're not going to Nashville anymore, son. Plans have changed. We're taking a different route tonight." Marcus noticed that Carl's eyes in the rearview mirror looked completely black, with no visible iris or pupil, just dark voids that seemed to absorb the dim interior lighting of the bus. Marcus immediately stood up and demanded to be let off, claiming he'd changed his mind about traveling. But Carl continued driving without acknowledging the request. The elderly woman and hooded figure remained motionless, but Marcus could feel their attention intensifying, as if his panic was somehow feeding their focus on him. He moved toward the front of the bus, intending to physically confront the driver if necessary. But as he approached Carl's seat, he realized something horrifying. The bus driver's hands on the steering wheel were gray and waxy, with fingernails that had grown unnaturally long. And there was no reflection of him in the large front windshield, despite the interior lights being bright enough to clearly show Marcus's own reflection. In desperation, Marcus tried the emergency exit handle near his original seat, but it wouldn't budge, as if it had been welded shut. The windows were tinted too dark to see outside clearly, but he could tell they were no longer on the interstate. The road had become narrower and more winding, taking them through what appeared to be dense forest with no visible signs of civilization. The elderly woman suddenly turned toward him, revealing a face that was partially decayed, with skin hanging in loose flaps and empty eye sockets that somehow still conveyed malevolent awareness. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but only a low, wet, rasping sound emerged. The hooded figure in the back stood up and began walking toward Marcus with movements that were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. As it got closer, Marcus could see that the face beneath the hood was that of a young man around his own age, but the skin was mottled purple and black, suggesting advanced decomposition, and there were what appeared to be impact wounds on the skull, as if from a severe car accident. The figure reached out toward Marcus with hands that ended in broken, bloody fingertips. Marcus grabbed an emergency fire extinguisher from its mounting bracket and smashed it through one of the side windows, ignoring the pain as glass shards cut his arms and face. The bus was moving at about 40 miles per hour, but his terror overrode any concern about injury from jumping. He threw himself through the broken window and hit the asphalt hard, rolling several times before coming to rest in the grass beside the road. When he looked back, expecting to see the bus slowing down or stopping, There was nothing there. Just empty highway stretching into the darkness in both directions. Marcus had no idea where he was or how to get back to civilization. But he began walking along the road in what he hoped was the direction they'd come from. He walked for hours through the night, growing increasingly dehydrated and disoriented, occasionally seeing headlights in the distance, but unable to flag down any vehicles. When dawn finally broke, he found himself on a rural highway he didn't recognize, with no signs pointing toward any cities or towns he'd heard of. 3 days later, a state trooper found Marcus collapsed beside Highway 65, about 60 miles from where he'd originally boarded the bus. He was severely dehydrated and suffering from cuts and bruises sustained during his escape from the vehicle. When paramedics examined him, they found injuries consistent with jumping from a moving vehicle, but also noted several other wounds that appeared older and more unusual. Circular marks on his arms and neck that looked almost like bite marks, but with an unusual spacing that didn't match any known animal. Marcus's story was initially dismissed as a hallucination brought on by dehydration and stress. But investigators became more concerned when they attempted to verify his account. There were no records of any Greyhound bus making unscheduled stops at the truck plaza where Marcus claimed to have been picked up. And the driver named Carl that he described didn't match any employee in the company's database. More disturbing, when authorities checked traffic cameras along the suspected route, they found footage of Marcus walking alone on the highway after his alleged escape, but no video evidence of any bus traveling that road during the time frame he specified. The investigation took an even stranger turn when local historians researched the area where Marcus was found. They discovered that the same stretch of highway had been the site of a fatal bus crash in 1967, which killed the driver and 2 passengers, an elderly woman and a teenage boy, matching the descriptions Marcus had provided of his fellow travelers. The crash had occurred on a foggy night when the bus driver, reportedly suffering from a heart attack, lost control and crashed into a tree. All 3 victims were found days later in an advanced state of decomposition due to the summer heat. Social services eventually placed Marcus with his sister in Detroit, where he underwent extensive counseling to deal with both his original family trauma and the psychological effects of his bus experience. He rarely speaks about that night, but caseworkers noted that he refuses to use public transportation and becomes visibly agitated when he sees Greyhound buses. Marcus maintains that what happened to him was real, not a hallucination, and believes that he somehow encountered the spirits of the 1967 crash victim, who were still trying to complete their final journey, taking living passengers along with them into whatever realm the dead inhabit. Local truckers and bus drivers still report strange incidents along that stretch of highway. Glimpses of an old-style bus that appears in their mirrors but vanishes when they look directly at it, or radio transmissions from drivers who identify themselves as Carl, requesting assistance with mechanical problems, though no bus is ever found when help arrives at the specified locations. Let's move to our 4th story. This account comes from the helmet camera footage recovered from Hazel, a 65-year-old retired history teacher who had taken up long-distance bicycle touring as her post-retirement passion. The footage was found by Oregon State Police 3 weeks after Hazel failed to return from what should have been a routine solo ride along the Pacific Coast Highway in October 2018. Her custom touring bicycle was discovered abandoned on a scenic overlook near Bandon, fully loaded with her camping gear and electronics. But Hazel herself was nowhere to be found. Hazel had been documenting her cross-country cycling adventure for her grandchildren, recording daily video logs using a helmet-mounted camera that automatically uploaded footage to cloud storage whenever she connected to Wi-Fi. The recovered videos show the progression of what started as an enjoyable solo ride through some of Oregon's most beautiful coastal scenery, gradually evolving into something far more sinister. Her final video entries, totaling nearly 4 hours of footage, provide a disturbing window into an experience that defies rational explanation. The first signs of trouble appear in Hazel's October 14th recording, filmed during what should have been a peaceful afternoon ride south of Florence. Hazel can be heard speaking cheerfully to her camera about the magnificent ocean views and perfect cycling weather. But careful analysis of the footage reveals something deeply unsettling in the background. At approximately 12 minutes into the recording, a second bicycle rider appears in the distance behind Hazel, maintaining the same speed and following the exact same path along the winding coastal highway. What makes this particularly strange is that Hazel appears completely unaware of the other cyclists' presence, never mentioning them or acknowledging their existence despite the figure being clearly visible in several shots. As the afternoon progresses, the mysterious follower becomes more prominent in the footage, gradually closing the distance between themselves and Hazel. The figure appears to be riding an older-style touring bicycle similar to Hazel's, wearing vintage cycling clothing that looks decades out of date. Wool jersey, leather helmet, and canvas panniers that haven't been manufactured since the 1970s. Most disturbing is the rider's posture and movement, which remain unnaturally consistent regardless of changes in terrain or wind conditions, as if they're not actually pedaling but somehow being propelled forward by an external force. Hazel's October 15th recording shows her setting up camp at Sunset Bay State Park, still apparently oblivious to the other cyclist who can be seen in the background, partially obscured by trees but clearly present throughout the entire setup process. The helmet camera captures Hazel preparing dinner, organizing her gear, and commenting on the beautiful sunset, while the mysterious figure remains motionless beside their bicycle roughly 50 yards away, never moving to set up their own camp or engage in any normal camping activities. When Hazel briefly walks away from her campsite to use the restroom facilities, the footage shows the figure moving closer to her tent, examining her belongings with movements that appear jerky and unnatural, like stop-motion animation. The most chilling moment comes during Hazel's nighttime recording, when she wakes up around 2 a.m. to investigate strange sounds outside her tent. The helmet camera's night vision mode reveals the mysterious cyclist standing directly beside Hazel's tent, close enough that she should have been able to hear their breathing or detect their presence, yet she shows no awareness of them whatsoever. The figure's face is partially visible in the infrared footage, revealing features that appear weathered and damaged, with what looks like severe road rash covering one side of their head and face as if from a high-speed cycling accident. Hazel's final coherent recording begins on the morning of October 16th. As she breaks camp and prepares to continue her journey south, the mysterious cyclist is visible in the background throughout the packing process. But for the first time, Hazel seems to sense something unusual, frequently looking over her shoulder and commenting that she feels unsettled and like someone might be watching her. She mentions to the camera that she had strange dreams about cycling accidents and feels an inexplicable urge to take a different route than she had originally planned, deciding to follow a less traveled inland road instead of continuing along the coast. The footage from this final day shows Hazel pedaling through increasingly remote and forested terrain, with the mysterious cyclist maintaining their constant presence behind her. As the day progresses, Hazel becomes visibly agitated, frequently checking over her shoulder and muttering about feeling like she's riding in circles, despite the GPS showing steady progress. The most disturbing aspect is that the landscape itself seems to be subtly changing throughout the recording, trees appearing and disappearing, road signs showing different information when passed multiple times, and scenic overlooks that somehow look different each time Hazel stops at them. Around 3 p.m., Hazel stops at what appears to be an abandoned rest area, commenting that it's not marked on any of her maps, but that she feels compelled to rest there. The helmet camera captures her sitting on a picnic table, eating lunch and trying to check her location on GPS. But the device appears to be malfunctioning, showing impossible coordinates that would place her simultaneously in multiple locations. Behind her, barely visible in the edge of the frame, the mysterious cyclist finally dismounts their bicycle and begins walking toward Hazel's position. As the figure approaches, Hazel suddenly becomes aware of their presence, turning around with a startled expression that quickly transforms into something approaching terror. The audio captures her saying, "Oh my God, you're not," before the recording cuts to static. When the video resumes several minutes later, Hazel appears to be back on her bicycle, pedaling frantically down a steep, winding road that doesn't match any of the terrain shown in earlier footage. She's breathing heavily and occasionally looking back over her shoulder, but the mysterious cyclist is no longer visible. The final moments of usable footage show Hazel arriving at what appears to be the scenic overlook where her bicycle was eventually found. She dismounts, walks to the guardrail, and stares out at the ocean for several minutes without speaking. The camera captures her saying, "I understand now. This is where it happened. This is where I'm supposed to..." Before the audio becomes garbled and unintelligible, the video then shows nothing but sky and clouds, as if the camera had fallen or been thrown, with occasional glimpses of what might be Hazel walking away from the overlook, heading toward a wooded trail that leads away from the road. Search and rescue teams spent weeks combing the area around the overlook and the surrounding forest, but found no trace of Hazel beyond her abandoned bicycle and equipment. The investigation revealed several puzzling details that couldn't be explained through conventional means. Analysis of the GPS data from Hazel's cycling computer showed that she had somehow traveled nearly twice the distance that the road actually covers, following routes that don't exist on any current maps. More disturbing, historical research revealed that the abandoned rest area visible in her final recording had been closed and demolished in 1987, following a fatal cycling accident in which a touring cyclist had been killed by a drunk driver. Local cycling enthusiasts and park rangers report occasional sightings of two bicycle riders on remote sections of the Pacific Coast Highway, always seen from a distance and always riding together, despite appearing to be from different time periods based on their equipment and clothing. These sightings invariably occur in areas where cycling accidents have happened over the years, leading some to theorize that Hazel encountered the spirit of a cyclist who died decades earlier and was somehow compelled to join them in an eternal ride along the coast. Hazel's family continues to search for answers, regularly checking with authorities and posting appeals on social media, but no additional evidence has ever been found. The helmet camera footage remains the only record of what happened during those final days, leaving investigators to wonder whether Hazel simply became lost and disoriented in the coastal wilderness, or whether she encountered something supernatural that exists in the spaces between the mapped roads and the endless miles of Pacific coastline. Let's move to our fifth story. This harrowing account comes from the emergency response records filed by Michigan State Police in November 2016, documenting the ordeal of Zoe and Atlas, a retired couple from Grand Rapids who had been traveling cross-country in their recreational vehicle. Zoe, 72, and Atlas, 75, had been married for 48 years and had recently begun fulfilling their dream of seeing America by RV after Atlas's retirement from his job as a high school principal. Their nightmare began during what should have been a routine overnight stop at a rest area along Interstate 75, just south of the Mackinac Bridge. Zoe and Atlas had been driving north toward Michigan's Upper Peninsula, planning to spend a few days exploring Mackinac Island before continuing their journey through Wisconsin and Minnesota. They pulled into the Strait State Park rest area around 6 p.m. on November 15th, intending to stay overnight in one of the designated RV parking areas. The weather was already showing signs of the severe storm system that meteorologists had been tracking across the Great Lakes region, with temperatures dropping rapidly and the first flurries of what would become a historic blizzard beginning to fall. According to Zoe's subsequent testimony to investigators, they had settled in for the evening, preparing dinner in their RV while listening to weather updates on the radio. The storm was predicted to intensify overnight, with blizzard conditions expected to make travel dangerous or impossible by morning. But they felt secure in their well-equipped RV with full propane tanks, adequate food supplies, and emergency equipment. Atlas had checked their vehicle's winterization systems and was confident they could weather the storm comfortably until conditions improved enough to continue their journey. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came around 9 p.m., when Zoe noticed that the other RVs and vehicles that had been parked nearby when they arrived were no longer visible. She initially assumed that the other travelers had decided to leave before the storm worsened. But when she looked out the window, she realized that the heavy snowfall had already begun to accumulate rapidly, creating a white curtain that made it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. More disturbing was the complete absence of any lights from the rest area facilities, which should have been illuminated throughout the night. By 10 p.m., the wind had increased dramatically, rocking their RV with such violence that Zoe and Atlas began to worry about the vehicle's stability. The temperature inside began dropping despite their heater running constantly, and they noticed that ice was forming on the inside of their windows, something that had never happened before in their well-insulated RV. Atlas attempted to check the outside temperature gauge, but discovered that all their electronic equipment had mysteriously stopped functioning, including their GPS, weather radio, and cell phones, despite having full battery charges and working perfectly just hours earlier. Around midnight, Zoe was awakened by what sounded like voices calling from outside their RV. Barely audible over the howling wind, but definitely human in nature. She woke Atlas, and together they listened to what appeared to be multiple people shouting for help, their voices seeming to come from different directions around their vehicle. Atlas, despite Zoe's protests, decided to investigate, bundling himself in heavy winter clothing and grabbing a powerful flashlight before stepping outside into the blizzard. What Atlas discovered outside defied all logic and reason. The rest area that had been familiar and well-maintained just hours earlier had somehow transformed into something entirely different. The modern facilities, paved parking areas, and landscaping had been replaced by what appeared to be an old-fashioned truck stop from decades past, complete with vintage fuel pumps, a small diner building with 1950s-style neon signage, and several other vehicles that looked like they belonged in a museum. The snow continued to fall heavily, but it seemed to be accumulating in impossible patterns, forming drifts that defied the direction of the wind and creating shapes that looked almost deliberate, like someone or something was sculpting the landscape. The voices Atlas had heard were coming from the occupants of the other vehicles, people who appeared to be stranded travelers from different time periods. He spoke briefly with a family in a 1960s station wagon who claimed they had been trapped at the location for 3 days, waiting for the storm to pass so they could continue their vacation to Mackinac Island. Another group, traveling in what appeared to be a 1940s sedan, insisted they had been stuck there for over a week, trying to get home to Detroit after visiting relatives in the Upper Peninsula. Most disturbing was the realization that all of these people seemed genuinely unaware that decades had passed since their original travel dates. When Atlas returned to the RV to tell Zoe what he had discovered, she insisted that he must be suffering from hypothermia-induced hallucinations, as nothing he described matched what she could see from the windows. According to her account, the view from inside their RV showed only the modern rest area buried under heavy snow, with no sign of the vintage buildings or other vehicles Atlas claimed to have encountered. This discrepancy between their perceptions created additional stress and confusion, as both were certain of what they were experiencing. As the night progressed, the temperature continued to drop to dangerous levels, far below anything predicted by the weather forecasts they had heard earlier. Their RV's heating system began struggling to maintain a comfortable interior temperature, and they noticed that their propane supply was being consumed at an alarming rate, as if the outside temperature was far colder than their gauges indicated. Zoe attempted to conserve heat by closing off sections of the RV and huddling together under multiple blankets. But they both began experiencing symptoms of severe cold exposure despite their preparations. Around 4 a.m., Atlas made another attempt to venture outside, this time hoping to reach the rest area building to call for emergency assistance. Zoe watched from the window as he walked toward what she could see as the modern facility building. But Atlas later insisted that he had entered the vintage diner from his earlier vision, where he encountered a waitress who served him coffee and told him that the storm had been going on for days with no signs of letting up. The waitress, according to Atlas, warned him that some travelers had been stranded at the location for much longer than they realized, losing track of time in ways that didn't make sense. Zoe's version of events during this period was markedly different. She reported watching Atlas walk toward the rest area building, but instead of entering it, he appeared to stop about halfway there and stand motionless in the falling snow for nearly an hour, seemingly oblivious to her attempts to call out to him. When he finally returned to the RV, he was suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite, requiring immediate warming measures and medical attention that Zoe was barely able to provide with her limited supplies. The storm finally began to subside around dawn on November 16th. But when Zoe looked outside, she discovered that their RV was completely buried in snowdrifts that had somehow formed around and over their vehicle, creating an almost cave-like enclosure. The amount of snow accumulation was far beyond anything that could have fallen in a single night, appearing to represent days or even weeks of continuous snowfall. More puzzling was the fact that there were no signs of the modern rest area facilities that should have been visible once the snow stopped falling. Zoe managed to dig a path from their RV door to what she hoped was the direction of the main road, following power lines that she could barely see above the snow. After hours of exhausting work in deep snow, she finally reached Interstate 75, where she was fortunate to flag down a state police patrol vehicle. The trooper who responded to her emergency call found Zoe suffering from exhaustion and exposure, while Atlas required immediate medical evacuation due to severe hypothermia and frostbite injuries. The rescue operation revealed several inexplicable aspects of their ordeal. When emergency crews reached their RV, they found it buried under snow accumulations that were significantly deeper than anywhere else in the area, despite the rest area receiving the same storm system as the surrounding region. The vintage buildings and vehicles that Atlas described were nowhere to be found, and there were no records of such facilities ever existing at that location. Most puzzling was the discovery that their RV's propane tanks were completely empty, despite having been full when they arrived, suggesting they had been running their heater for far longer than the single night they remembered. Atlas spent several days in the hospital recovering from his cold-related injuries, and both he and Zoe required counseling to process their traumatic experience. They sold their RV shortly after the incident and never resumed their cross-country travel plans. Zoe still insists that they experienced a single night of severe weather, while Atlas maintains that they were trapped in some kind of temporal anomaly where past and present intersected, causing them to experience multiple timelines simultaneously. The Michigan State Police investigation found no evidence to support either version of events, classifying the incident as an unexplained weather-related emergency. Let's move to our sixth story. This chilling account comes from the police report filed by the Alabama State Police following an incident on Highway 78 near the Tennessee border in August 2009. The case involved 5 friends in their early 20s who had been traveling together from Birmingham to Nashville for a music festival weekend. The group consisted of Jake, 22, who was driving his father's pickup truck along with his passengers, Tyler and Connor, both 21, and their girlfriends Madison and Brittany, also 21. What should have been a routine 3-hour drive became a nightmare that would leave the survivors traumatized, and one member of their group missing forever. The friends had left Birmingham around 7 p.m. on Friday evening, planning to drive through the night to reach Nashville in time for the festival's opening events on Saturday morning. Jake had made this drive several times before and was familiar with the route, which took them through some of Alabama's more remote rural areas before crossing into Tennessee. The group was in high spirits, looking forward to their weekend of music and celebration, with Tyler acting as DJ, using his phone connected to the truck's sound system, while the others shared snacks and drinks they had brought for the journey. According to the survivors' testimony, the first sign that something was wrong came around 9:30 p.m. when they noticed a pair of headlights that had been following them for an unusually long time. Connor, who was sitting in the back seat where he could see behind them clearly, mentioned that the same vehicle had been maintaining the exact same distance behind them for over an hour, never attempting to pass despite several opportunities on straight stretches of highway. Jake initially dismissed this as coincidence, figuring they were simply traveling in the same direction at similar speeds. But as the evening wore on, the persistent presence of the following vehicle began to make everyone uncomfortable. The situation escalated when Jake decided to test whether they were actually being followed by taking an unplanned exit at a small town called Coleman, intending to stop for gas and see if the other vehicle would continue past them on the main highway. Instead, the mysterious car followed them off the exit and into the gas station parking lot, positioning itself at the far end of the lot where the occupants could observe Jake's truck without being clearly visible themselves. The friends could see that it appeared to be an older sedan with tinted windows, but they couldn't make out any details about the driver or passengers, or even get a clear look at the license plate from their distance. Madison suggested they call the police, but the others argued that they hadn't actually been threatened and weren't sure they had enough evidence to convince authorities that they were being stalked, rather than simply dealing with an unfortunate coincidence. Jake decided they should get back on the highway and see what happened, hoping that the other vehicle was simply making a routine stop and would head in a different direction. However, as soon as they pulled out of the gas station and merged back onto Highway 78, the sedan reappeared behind them, resuming its previous position at exactly the same distance. By 11 p.m., the friends were genuinely frightened. and Jake began driving more aggressively, speeding up and slowing down, changing lanes frequently, and taking sudden turns onto side roads in an attempt to lose their pursuer. Nothing they tried worked. The sedan matched every maneuver perfectly, maintaining its consistent distance regardless of changes in speed or direction. Most disturbing was the realization that the following vehicle seemed to anticipate their moves, sometimes beginning to turn or change lanes before Jake had even made his intentions clear through turn signals or positioning. Around midnight, they found themselves on a particularly isolated stretch of rural highway, with no other traffic visible in either direction. Tyler suggested using his phone to call 911, but when he tried, he discovered that they had no cell phone service, which was unusual since they had all had good signals just minutes earlier. The truck's radio also began malfunctioning, cycling through static and picking up strange transmissions that sounded like conversations in languages none of them recognized, mixed with what sounded like old-fashioned radio programs from decades past. The most terrifying moment came when Jake spotted what appeared to be a roadblock ahead. Several vehicles parked across both lanes of the highway, with flashing lights that looked like police cars. As they approached, however, they realized that something was very wrong with the scene. The vehicles were old-fashioned police cars that looked like they belonged in a museum, and the uniformed figures standing beside them moved in jerky, unnatural ways that reminded Connor of old silent movies. When Jake slowed down and rolled down his window to speak to one of the officers, the man who approached their truck had a face that was pale and waxy, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Without waiting to hear what the figure might say, Jake floored the accelerator and drove straight through the roadblock, swerving around the parked vehicles and ignoring the shouts from behind them. As they sped away, Brittany, who was looking back through the rear window, screamed that the police figures were returning to their cars and beginning to pursue them. But their movements were wrong. Too fast and too fluid, as if they weren't bound by normal human physical limitations. What followed was a high-speed chase through the dark rural countryside, with Jake pushing his father's truck to its mechanical limits, while trying to stay ahead of multiple pursuing vehicles that seemed to be gaining ground despite his best efforts. The friends later estimated that the chase lasted for nearly 2 hours, taking them down roads that didn't appear on any map and through landscapes that seemed to shift and change around them. Brittany reported seeing the same farmhouse and red barn pass by their windows multiple times, as if they were driving in circles, while Tyler insisted that the stars overhead were moving in patterns that defied the rotation of the earth. The nightmare finally ended when they found themselves back on a familiar section of Highway 78, with normal cell phone service restored and no sign of their pursuers anywhere behind them. Exhausted and traumatized, they pulled over at the first rest area they found and called the Alabama State Police to report what had happened. However, when the responding officers arrived, they discovered that Madison was no longer in the truck with the others. Jake, Tyler, Connor, and Brittany had no memory of when or how she had disappeared, and all four insisted that she had been with them throughout the entire ordeal. A massive search operation was launched to find Madison, involving state police, local sheriff's departments, search and rescue teams, and volunteer groups. Helicopters searched the rural areas where the friends claimed to have been chased, while ground teams combed through farmland and forest, looking for any sign of the missing woman. The investigation revealed several puzzling inconsistencies in the survivor's account. GPS data from their cell phones showed that they had never left the main highway, contradicting their claims of being chased through back roads, and the truck's odometer indicated they had traveled far more miles than the distance between Birmingham and their location when they called police. Most disturbing was the discovery that there had been no police roadblocks or traffic stops reported in the area that night. And none of the law enforcement agencies in the region had any record of officers being deployed to Highway 78 during the time frame the friends described. Security cameras at the gas station in Cullman showed Jake's truck arriving and departing. But there was no footage of any other vehicle following them, despite Connor's clear memory of the sedan being present in the parking lot. Madison's disappearance remains unsolved, and the four survivors rarely speak about that night, though they all continue to insist that their memories of the events are accurate. Jake never drove that route again and sold his father's truck within a month of the incident. Tyler and Connor both report ongoing sleep problems and anxiety attacks, while Brittany moved to a different state shortly after the investigation concluded. Local residents of the rural areas along Highway 78 occasionally report seeing a young woman walking along the roadside at night. But whenever authorities investigate these sightings, they find no trace of anyone matching Madison's description. The Alabama State Police investigation ultimately concluded that the friends had experienced some kind of shared psychological episode, possibly triggered by fatigue, stress, or environmental factors, but acknowledged that this explanation didn't account for Madison's disappearance or the physical evidence that suggested they had traveled much farther than should have been possible given their timeline and route. Let's move to our seventh story. This final account comes from the rideshare records and police investigation files following the disappearance of Michael, a 45-year-old corporate executive who vanished during what should have been a routine Uber ride from downtown Washington, D.C. to Reagan National Airport in September 2020. Michael had been attending a business conference at the Marriott downtown and needed to catch a red-eye flight back to his home in San Francisco, where his wife Carmen and two teenage children were waiting for his return. The ride he booked through the Uber app would become one of the most documented yet inexplicable missing persons cases in the Washington metropolitan area. Michael had checked out of his hotel at 9:30 p.m. and used the Uber app to request a ride to the airport for his 11:45 p.m. flight. According to the app's records, his driver was listed as David, a 42-year-old part-time Uber driver who had been working for the platform for over 3 years with an excellent rating and no complaints or incidents in his driving history. The pickup was scheduled for 9:45 p.m. outside the hotel's main entrance, and GPS tracking showed that David's vehicle, a silver Toyota Camry, arrived at the designated location right on schedule. Hotel security cameras captured Michael walking out of the lobby at exactly 9:44 p.m., carrying a single rolling suitcase and his laptop bag, checking his phone presumably to confirm his driver's arrival. The footage shows him approaching a silver sedan that matches the description of David's vehicle, speaking briefly with someone inside the car, and then getting into the back seat. The timestamp on the security footage shows 9:46 p.m. when the car pulled away from the hotel, heading in the direction that would normally lead to the airport via the most direct route. This is where the case becomes deeply troubling and defies logical explanation. According to the Uber app's GPS tracking system, Michael's ride followed an impossible route that no human driver could have taken. The tracking data shows the vehicle traveling at consistent speeds through areas of downtown D.C., where no roads exist, including directly through the middle of government buildings, across the Potomac River without using any bridges or tunnels, and through residential neighborhoods that were completely blocked off for construction during that time period. Most bizarre of all, the GPS track shows the vehicle moving in a perfectly straight line from the hotel to the airport, ignoring all traffic patterns, road layouts, and physical obstacles. The ride was supposed to take approximately 25 minutes given normal traffic conditions, but the app showed the trip as completed in exactly 18 minutes, with Michael being dropped off at Reagan National Airport at 10:04 p.m. However, when airport security reviewed surveillance footage from the terminal entrances and parking areas, there was no record of Michael arriving at the airport that night. No cameras captured him entering any terminal, no boarding pass was scanned in his name, and airline records confirmed that he never checked in for his scheduled flight. Carmen became concerned when Michael failed to call her, as he always did when his flight landed, and she couldn't reach him on his cell phone throughout the night. When she contacted the airline the next morning, they informed her that Michael had been listed as a no-show for his flight. She immediately contacted the D.C. Metropolitan Police, who began investigating Michael's disappearance as a missing persons case. The investigation quickly focused on the Uber ride, as it was the last documented activity associated with Michael's disappearance. When police attempted to contact David, the supposed Uber driver, they discovered that no driver by that name existed in Uber's system. The vehicle information, license plate number, and driver profile that had appeared in Michael's app were completely fabricated, with no corresponding records in any motor vehicle databases. More disturbing was Uber's insistence that they had no record of Michael's ride request or any trip associated with his account that evening, despite the fact that Michael's phone showed the completed trip and even a receipt for the fare in his email. The investigation revealed several technical impossibilities that computer experts couldn't explain. Michael's phone had somehow connected to and interacted with a driver profile and vehicle that didn't exist in Uber's system, completing a financial transaction for a ride that officially never happened. The GPS tracking data that showed the impossible route was stored locally on Michael's phone, but didn't exist on Uber's servers, as if his device had been communicating with a parallel version of the app that operated outside the company's actual system. Michael's credit card was charged for the ride, but when investigators traced the transaction, the money had been transferred to an account that financial institutions insisted didn't exist. The payment had somehow been processed through normal banking systems, despite being connected to fraudulent account information that should have been immediately flagged and rejected by security protocols. The bank's own investigation concluded that the transaction was technically impossible given their security measures. Yet the charge remained on Michael's account. The case became even more bizarre when investigators interviewed hotel staff and reviewed additional security footage. The hotel's valet reported that he had been outside during the entire time period when Michael supposedly got into the Uber, and he insisted that no vehicles had stopped in front of the hotel between 9:40 and 10 p.m. that evening. Security cameras from neighboring buildings, traffic cameras, and even tourists' social media posts from the area showed no evidence of the silver Toyota Camry that Michael had apparently entered. Most unsettling was the discovery that Michael's phone had continued to transmit location data for several hours after he disappeared. But the signals were coming from locations that made no geographical sense. Cell tower records showed his phone moving through the D.C. area in patterns that would have required traveling through solid buildings, underground tunnels that didn't exist, and at one point, apparently hovering several hundred feet above the Potomac River for over an hour before the signal went dead, permanently. 3 weeks after Michael's disappearance, Carmen received a single text message from his phone, which read, "The driver knew where I really needed to go. Don't worry about me. Some journeys don't have destinations you can find on any map." When investigators traced the message, they found it had been sent from a location that didn't correspond to any real place. The GPS coordinates pointed to an area that would be floating in midair above the Lincoln Memorial. The FBI eventually took over the case due to its unusual technical aspects and potential cybersecurity implications. But their investigation also reached dead ends. Computer forensics experts examined Michael's phone and laptop, finding evidence of his interaction with the phantom Uber ride, but no explanation for how such an interaction could have occurred with non-existent systems and accounts. The case was eventually classified as an unexplained disappearance with possible technology-related factors, though investigators privately admitted they had no theories that could account for the evidence. Carmen and her children moved back to her family in Texas 6 months after Michael's disappearance, unable to cope with the uncertainty and the constant media attention the case had generated. She rarely speaks publicly about the incident, though she did mention in one interview that she sometimes receives brief text messages from Michael's old phone number, always containing cryptic references to traveling on roads that don't appear on any maps, and riding with drivers who exist between the spaces where technology connects our world. The Marriott hotel where Michael was staying has since upgraded their security systems and now requires additional verification for any rideshare pickups. Though hotel management has never officially acknowledged any connection to Michael's disappearance. Some guests report that the area where Michael was last seen getting into the phantom Uber sometimes experiences unexplained technical malfunctions. Cell phones lose signal, GPS systems give impossible directions, and occasionally, rideshare apps show vehicles and drivers that don't exist when passengers try to book rides from that exact location. Technology experts who have studied the case privately theorize that Michael may have somehow interfaced with a glitch or overlap between digital systems and something else entirely, possibly explaining how he could interact with an Uber system that didn't exist in our reality, but was somehow accessible through his phone. Whether this represents a technological anomaly, a glimpse into parallel dimensions, or something else beyond current understanding, remains an open question that continues to puzzle investigators and researchers who study unexplained disappearances in our increasingly connected digital world. The most disturbing aspect of Michael's case isn't just that he vanished without a trace, but that he disappeared into a version of our world that exists only in the spaces between digital connections and physical reality. His story serves as a chilling reminder that in our technology-dependent age, the line between what's real and what's possible has become increasingly blurred. And sometimes the most dangerous roads are the ones that exist only in the electronic networks that connect our devices to each other. That concludes our journey through 7 of the most disturbing true road trip horror stories ever documented. Each of these cases reminds us that the roads we travel every day can sometimes lead to destinations that exist far beyond our understanding. Places where the normal rules of reality seem to break down and people can simply vanish without a trace. If these stories have taught us anything, it's that the most terrifying journeys aren't always the ones we plan to take, but the ones that find us when we least expect them. Thank you for joining me on Silent Fears, where we explore the darkness that lurks just beyond the headlights of everyday life. Until next time, drive safely and remember, sometimes the road you're on isn't the one you think you're traveling.